Okay, so everyone can hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay. So, morning everyone, and hope you all had a good breakfast and have no hangovers from yesterday. So, our topic is constraint-based game design and how it encourages creativity. So, before we start, an introduction about ourselves. So, us two here are basically 2/3 of the game development team called Zombies in the House. My name is Diptoman Mukherjee, and I'm a final year undergraduate computer science student. And I've been making games for like around 10 years now, like trying to make games mostly. So I take care of the design and programming part in our team. And this guy here is Rahul Narayanan. He's a game artist, and not surprisingly, takes care of the game art in our games. The other guy is Constraint-Based. He can't be here because he has his exams and all that. So these are some of the stuff we have worked on in the past. Some of you may have played the first two. We were showcasing them yesterday for the Student Game of the Year Awards. The one below that was the winner of last year's Student Game of the Awards here. Meanwhile, in a parallel universe, we were also selected as like one of the launch titles for the Tizen operating system. And apart from like larger game projects, we also participate in a shitload of game jams, and these are all results of that. So like what we'll be talking about today will mostly revolve around our experiences with those game jams and like the constraints that are imposed on those jams and like how we can learn from them and what paths we should go about and like how it encourages creativity in general. So the first question we're going to raise is why do we need constraints? So by constraints, I mean like anything in the form of theme, time, budget, team restrictions, and whatever. So like wouldn't just be easier if we had like an unlimited budget, huge team, and lots of time? Well, like any of you think that? Cool, no one thinks that, so this talk is kind of useless then. But okay, so some of you may think that, but I'm going to explain why that's not an ideal case scenario. So firstly, like let's say you are an experienced developer and you are comfortable where you are and you have like created a comfort zone for yourselves. So game design is basically like solving a lot of game dev problems, right? So you use your past experiences to solve those problems. So you know the safe route to like solving a problem, and you know what has worked well for you in the past. So in short, like your methods have stagnated. So this is where like constraints come into play. If there's a restriction that's preventing you from going down that safe route, you're gonna have to like forced to think of an alternate solution, or like trying a different approach to the same solution. So an example here would be like, say like your team is under like heavy time and budget constraints, and that skill set doesn't like allow for something particular. So your team will have to think of some way like to overcome that, or like find another solution to get that same effect. So this is the first part of encouraging creativity. Constraints are going to force you out of your comfort zone. So like finding the alternate solutions and like coming up with new ideas. How do you do that? You do that by thinking out of the box. So like you may have already existing ideas, and you can already fit those ideas with currently self-imposed constraints, and you're going to come up with new ideas like that. We're going to explain that later under thematic constraints. So yeah, the thinking out of the box is like the second step to encouraging creativity. So that's the gist of what we're going to talk about. So like all that was fine in theory and all, but what may actually happen without constraints? So there's a term for that. It's called development hell. So development hell is like when the game stays in the development phase and it doesn't move on to the production phase. So and like many games don't even make it out of that stage, but for games that do, this one is a perfect example. Like any of you have played Duke Nukem Forever? Cool. So like do you know how much time it took to develop that game? It took 15 years. Yeah, so this thing was originally announced back in 1997, and it finally came out in 2011. It was announced like after Duke Nukem 3D success. So the creator wanted to make the best looking game for this, and so he had no like time constraints or whatever. So with constantly changing engine technologies, like he had to change the game a lot during development, and hence the long development time. And even after it came out, it didn't really receive very positive response, and it's generally considered a failure in the industry. So another well-known example is Spore. This thing took 8 years in development. And it was originally announced back in 2005, finally came out in 2008. Yeah, so but what finally came out in 2008, it wasn't exactly the version that was showcased. It lacked a lot of features that were originally showcased, and it was kind of like a stripped down version of 5 other different games. So that was because they had to like remove what they originally planned during development and like add less features and all that. So one final example is Alan Wake. It's a psychological thriller by Remedy Entertainment. So this took 6 years in development. It was originally announced back in 2005, came out in 2010. So it was originally supposed to be an open world game. So if any of you have played Alan Wake, it's the furthest thing from an open world game. It follows a linear narrative. So they had to scrap that open world idea to limit the scope of the game, and they could have saved up dev time if they like thought of that before and had those constraints. So I've been only talking about games which like made it out of that phase, but there are a lot of games which don't make it out, and like some of those even fail without going to the development phase. And you can like find a lot of examples in Kickstarter. So projects which have failed funding or projects which have failed to deliver after funding. So like from the top of my head, there's this game called Yog Ventures. It was by the Yogscast group. So they like raised $550,000 and had over 13,000 backers. But the game failed like soon after soon entering development phase, because they like promised a lot of stuff. Like they promised randomly generated game worlds, they promised an in-game physics engine, they promised like crafting, customizable characters and all that. And it was too ambitious for the devs. So they like failed at the beginning, and it was like $550,000 lost. So before going into the next part, I'm going to talk a little about game jams and how they help. So like, how many of you have heard of game jams and participated in game jams? Okay, so a lot. So for those who don't know, there are like two main constants during game jams. They are theme and time. So the idea is for every team, you're given a theme, and you have to come up a game based on that theme in a particular amount of time, usually 2 or 3 days. So it's ideal for prototyping, and you get to see like whether people like your concept or not, and you get to take that to a full-scale game from there. So some on-site game jams also have other restrictions on like team, because you have to like team up with random people you barely know, and you have to juggle the strengths and weaknesses on the fly for best outcome. Some also have like restrictions on the technology you can use. So some common game jams are listed here. There we have the Global Game Jam. It's the largest game jam. It's held once every year. Its India center was at Bangalore. And then we have the largest off-site game jam called the Ludum Dare. It's held once every 4 months. There are a lot of other game jams as well, and you can find like all information about these game jams from the CompoHub website. That's compohub.net. So the next part will be covered by Rahul, so I'll just pass it on to him.
Hello. I'll be talking about the initial constraints. And the first constraint is the budget. And by budget, I directly mean limited resources. When you have limited resources, you will have to use and reuse your assets in multiple places in a creative way and in an effective way. And when you start your own company or your own studio, if I may say, then you will definitely face the constraint of a limited budget. But you don't need to fret, because a lot of developers, especially in the mobile scene, have come up with beautiful and brilliant games with just a handful of people and a limited budget. The next constraint is time. And time is directly related to the budget. And in game jams especially, you just have 2 to 3 days of development time for creating the game. So you'll have to manage your time properly, and you'll have to focus on the polishing of the assets and the mechanics rather than the polishing the presentation. For the team, which is a constraint, that you have to manage the proper size of the team, because if the team is too large, then you will have to manage all the members, and that will take a lot of time. But if your team is too small, then the workload on the team members will be too much. Also, you might have to drop a few mechanics in your game based on the strengths and weaknesses of your team. But you can work around these weaknesses and still create the game. For example, the creators of Hubrix had once mentioned in their postmortem that they weren't too strong on the art front. So that is why they went with a simple art style, and it worked out for them. So this is how you manage the weaknesses of your team and move ahead. The next constraint and the last constraint of the initial set is the target platform. And this is very important as it affects the game design directly, and it also partially dictates the mechanics as well as the target audience. You'll have to be very careful while creating the controls for each platform, and you should ensure that the controls seamlessly transition from one platform to the other.
So yeah, thematic constants. So this is basically like the main part of the presentation, and thematic constants are like parts of all game jams. So the idea here is you're given a theme and you have to like think up a game idea based on that. And you can think of the game idea in a lot of ways. So the first and most obvious one is like you base the mechanic of the game based on that theme. And this is usually harder to do. Like if you take BYOG 2014, for example, they had themes like shell and parenting, and it was like hard to base mechanics on. So like most of the teams went with either visuals or story or some like vague reference to the theme. And then we can, of course, have visuals based on the theme. We can have stylized art assets if the theme allows it. And we can also have like imagery and stuff. And we can also base the story on the theme. So like if you check out any Ludum Dare competition, so you're going to find like weird and like wonderful, touching, and to simply downright ridiculous stories in every game jam. So I'm now going to give some examples of like jams we have participated in and some other thematic constants which can be self-imposed on the design of the game, like which help generate like new kinds of ideas and how it can fit existing ideas into like those constraints. So the first example we have here is one chance or permadeath. So the permadeath is basically the constraint that once the player dies, he doesn't respawn, he doesn't regain any of his abilities and all that. So this is like a rare constraint and it's usually harder to go with. But it has like some really interesting results. For take an extreme example of this is the game shown above. It's called Execution. It's by Jesse Van Brux. So the game is like basically you are given a choice at the start, and once you go through with that choice, the game will never start again. It won't play ever again. So like it was an interesting experiment to like check what kind of what choices players made first. But of course, this isn't like exactly a commercially viable idea. So on the lines of that, I'm going to mention Upsilon Circuit. It's the one below. It's an upcoming game, and so like the idea there is in every session there are players and there are watchers. So like one player plays and everyone else watches that. So once that player dies in that game, he is swapped with a watcher, and that watcher now becomes a player. And that player can never rejoin the game as a player again. He will stay as the watcher as long as the session stays. So the session ends as long as there are no more watchers to swap. And so it's not out yet, and I'm really looking forward to it and how it does. So like on the lines of more successful games which have used permadeath, we have like Firaxis's XCOM Enemy Unknown, and then we have Mothmouth Spelunky. Glitch, this is another example of a theme. So this is like a theme I really liked, and it was the theme for a game jam called the Game Jolt Glitch Jam. So we participated in it ourselves, and the game above, it's called Regalia Alpha. It's one of our games. So like we generated that idea based solely on that glitch theme. So it's like the glitch theme can be like interpreted in a lot of ways. It can be mechanic based, it can be visuals based, it can be story based. So for example, in our game, like the story is basically like there's a glitch has entered into an MMORPG, and it's like forcing everyone to level down and get stuck. And you are the only one left who can like actually move and stuff. So there are a lot of glitchy visuals in the game as well, like to enforce that idea. And the mechanic is revolving around like leveling down. Like instead of gaining more powers, you lose more powers. Like whatever powers you use more. So like we generated this idea like solely based on this glitch theme, right? We thought of what we could make with a glitch idea and came up with this, which probably wouldn't have otherwise happened if this jam didn't occur. So like another game which I really liked in this jam was called TV. It's the one shown below. So it's like an endless runner, except unlike in standard endless runners, this thing changes its format and the controls of the game randomly after every few seconds because of a glitch. So that helps keep the game fresh and like refreshing. So another game, I'm not showing it here, but it came in second place in the jam. It was called Glitch Dungeon. So it was a platformer where they had an intentionally included glitch in the game, and like you could edit values, like in-game values and all that, and you could like alter the game world based on that. So like you could alter the game world and like create a pathway for you and all that stuff. So it was a really novel platformer. They're probably making it a full-scale game now. So another example is build and use. So this was also the theme of a game jam. Like this looks like a simple, straightforward mechanic-based theme, but like people also found ways to use it in stories. So we had games like there was a game which was about like building a personality and like using that personality. It was completely a story-based game. So like our own entry was called Fort Blocks. It was like a standard tower defense, except like we had given like manual control to like every turret, like unlike in standard tower defense games. So the idea was, this idea originated from the using part. Like when we heard build and use, we thought up like what we could make using that theme, and the first genre that popped up was tower defense, right? But tower defense genres are kind of stale by now. So like we thought, how could we make it new? So we came up with that using part. So like we could use every turret manually for shooting and all that. So, and there are some turrets which cannot be like controlled automatically as well. You have to like control them manually. So this another game which came out of this jam, it's one of my favorites, and it's out on app stores now. It's called Must Go Up. It's by Jesse Venbrooks. It's the one shown below. So it's like a physics-based game where you build a spaceship and you shoot and stuff and you must go up. So it's like a really interesting physics-based space exploration game and all that. So one final example would be memories. So this is a theme I personally chose for a game jam, and it like worked out really well for that jam because there were a lot of interesting ideas. So this could have been like interpreted in a lot of ways as well. So this is one game jam where we fit an existing idea to like fit with this given constraint. So the existing idea was that we wanted to make an endless game which would have a randomly generated story. So I know that sounds conflicting because endless games can't usually have a story, but see, like the idea was we have 5 stages of life for a person, and for every stage of life we have a shitload of memories. So like every time the player plays, he's gonna be shown like one random memory from all those memory set. So like every time he plays, it will be a different story altogether, like based on which part of life you are in. And so like it's supposed to be endless, so like after you die, your child plays there and all that. So it didn't quite turn out as well as we hoped, but the whole idea of game jams is getting feedback, right? And this is one of our most successful jam games. This came in 4th place in Ludumdare. So another game which I would like to talk about is this.
Into the art and the audio as well. So let's talk about the art first. As we discussed earlier, the strength of the team is very important. It is important to maintain the right balance for your team, and based on the strengths and weaknesses of your team, you'll have to manage the assets accordingly. The next constraint would be choosing 2D or 3D, and this depends on the type of game. Like if you're making a platformer, 2D sprites would suffice. But if you're making an open world, then you would probably need 3D models. And next is the stylized or proportionate art style that you'll want to follow. If you want to convey a certain mood or a feel in a game, then you'll have to use stylized graphics. Here, TF2 or Team Fortress 2. Have you played Team Fortress 2, anyone? Yeah, so Team Fortress 2 is something that changes the entire art style of a FPS game. I think it is very different from usual first-person shooters, and that is why it stands apart. So maybe you should start experimenting on different art styles while you're making your game. The next constraint is detail or resolution, and this depends on the time. If you have less time, I would personally recommend you guys to use pixel art, especially in game jams, because you will be able to complete all your assets as well as the animation on time with proper detail and proper keyframes. So high resolution definitely has its own perks, but it takes a long time to create, and time is of the essence, especially in game jams.
So audio constraints. So audio constraints are mainly like the timing the audio and like whether the audio is looping or not. So we have to build an atmosphere with the audio, right? So as a designer, we have to like time all the audio right. So plus there are other constraints like for old school games, we have the audio bit depth. We need to make like 8 or 16-bit audio. Furthermore, like take for example in horror games, the atmosphere is built up on the audio. So we need to like carefully select what kind of audio we use because excessive audio is going to ruin the mood. Same with any kind of atmospheric games. So moving on to technical constraints, the first one is pretty obvious. It's the engine we use. The engine selection not only depends on like the scope of the project, it also depends upon your team skill set, what your end aim is in the end, and all that stuff. So like engine selection is important because you are going to be limited by the restrictions of that engine all the while you're programming.